In the early 15th century, France was a kingdom in crisis. A long-running conflict with England, the 100 Years' War, had reignited, and a bitter civil feud split the French nobility. Into this turmoil stepped a boy of 14, Charles of Valois, who would one day be King Charles VII of France. As a teenager, Charles assumed political and military leadership in one of France's darkest hours. Civil war raged between rival French factions, English armies invaded from across the Channel, and the French king's sanity hung by a thread. In this chaotic landscape, young Charles had to fight not only for his rightful crown, but for the very survival of France. This is the story of Charles VII's early life and wartime leadership, a journey that begins with a desperate boy prince and ends with the foundations of France's comeback, aided by an unexpected heroine named Joan of Arc. A kingdom divided, France in the early 14th century. To understand Charles's story, we must first picture the fractured France of his youth. At the start of the 1400s, France was one of Europe's great kingdoms on paper, but it was riven by internal strife. King Charles VI, Charles's father, suffered bouts of madness, rendering him incapable of steady rule. Powerful nobles vied to control the kingdom in his stead. Two opposing factions emerged, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. The Armagnacs, led by the Duke of Orléans' family and later by Count Bernard of Armagnac, championed the royal Valois line, and thus young Charles. The Burgundians, led by the Dukes of Burgundy, were a rival branch of the royal family with their own ambitions. In 1407, a shocking event deepened this divide. Duke John of Burgundy, called John the Fearless, had Louis, Duke of Orléans, the king's brother, assassinated in Paris. This act ignited a civil war between the Burgundian faction and the supporters of Orléans, who came to be known as the Armagnacs, after Bernard of Armagnac, their influential leader. By the 1410s, while this French civil war simmered, the kingdom's old enemy, England, took advantage of the disarray. In 1415, King Henry V of England invaded northern France, seeking to press his claim to the French crown. The invasion led to the infamous Battle of Agincourt in October 1415, a catastrophic defeat for France. In a muddy field, English longbowmen and men-at-arms annihilated the flower of French knighthood. Estimates say thousands of French soldiers, many of them noblemen, were killed in a single day. Among the dead were powerful lords, officers, and even the Constable of France. The French leadership was decimated. The prestige of the French army was in tatters, and the road into northern France lay open to the triumphant Henry V. The calamity at Agincourt sent shockwaves through the nation. Whole noble lineages were extinguished or left leaderless. The Armagnac faction, which had led the French army at Agincourt, was gravely weakened. Even the young Duke of Orléans, the son of the murdered Louis, was captured by the English, removing another key figure from the board. In the wake of Agincourt, French morale plummeted, and King Charles VI's court sank further into dysfunction. The king's bouts of insanity meant he often didn't recognize his own family or know who he was. Rival relatives and councillors manipulated the situation. Paris, the capital, became a powder keg of unrest. Just 2 years earlier, in 1413, a mob of Parisians had risen up in violent protests against corruption and high taxes. The riotous mob even invaded the royal residence, the Hôtel Saint-Paul, terrifying the royal family and the 10-year-old Prince Charles. Violence and instability were the backdrop of Charles's childhood. Fearing for the prince's safety and seeking allies, the royal family arranged in 1413 to betroth Charles, then aged 10, to Marie of Anjou, a princess from the powerful house of Anjou. Charles was sent to the Loire Valley to live under the protection and tutelage of his future mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, the Duchess of Anjou. Yolande was a formidable political figure, shrewd, strong-willed, and experienced in governance. In the relative calm of Anjou, young Charles was exposed to Yolande's guidance. She provided the boy with stability, education, and political training, away from the dangerous intrigues of Paris. For a time, Charles could grow up in a safer environment, learning statecraft from a strong mentor. By 1416, Charles, at age 13, returned to Paris and was given responsibilities despite his youth. He was appointed Captain General of Paris and began to sit on the Royal Council. This was largely symbolic at first, but it signaled that Charles was being groomed for leadership. The political situation, however, continued to unravel. The French Civil War worsened as the Armagnac and Burgundian factions literally fought in the streets for control of the king and the capital. And all the while, the English under Henry V pressed their advantage, capturing town after town in Normandy. The young dauphin, Charles at 14. In April 1417, a fateful change occurred in Charles's life. His older brother, Louis, Dauphin of France, died suddenly at the age of 18. Louis had been the heir to the throne and the hope of the Armagnac faction. His death, likely from illness, left the 15-year-old Charles next in line. Thus, in 1417, Charles became Dauphin of France, the title given to the heir apparent. He was just 14 years old. For a boy who had been the fifth son of the king and never expected to inherit the throne, this was a tremendous shift in destiny. Charles assumed the title of Dauphin at one of the worst moments imaginable. France was losing the war against the English invaders, and the Burgundian-Armagnac civil conflict was approaching a climax. Still, there was little time for the young prince to ease into his role. Immediately upon becoming Dauphin, Charles found himself thrust into leadership. His father, Charles VI, was alive but incapacitated by mental illness. Someone needed to direct the kingdom's defense and administration. The Armagnac faction, who still controlled Paris in 1417, moved swiftly to shore up the new Dauphin's authority. They declared Charles Lieutenant General of the kingdom, effectively making the 14-year-old prince the acting head of state on behalf of his ailing father. In practice, this meant Charles was the figurehead of the Armagnac government, advised and guided by experienced Armagnac ministers and generals. Chief among these was Bernard, Count of Armagnac, who had become Constable of France, the king's military commander, and the dominant force in the royal council. Bernard of Armagnac and others likely hoped to use the young Dauphin's name to unify their supporters against both the English and the Burgundians. However, even within Charles's own family, loyalty was divided. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, Charles's mother, had grown hostile to the Armagnac faction, partly because she blamed them for earlier uprisings and for holding the king under their control. In a stunning betrayal, Queen Isabeau abandoned Paris in 1417 and allied herself with John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, the very man who had ordered the murder of her brother-in-law years before. This meant that the Dauphin's own mother had sided with his political enemies. Isabeau and the Burgundians formed their own breakaway government in opposition to the Armagnacs in Paris, casting doubt on young Charles's legitimacy and intentions. The royal family was split down the middle. The king was mentally unfit, the queen backed Burgundy, and the Dauphin became the figurehead of the Armagnac cause. It was a recipe for disaster, and disaster soon struck. Flight from Paris. The night of betrayal, 1418. By early 1418, the military and political situation in France reached a boiling point. King Henry V of England continued to press southward after his victory at Agincourt, capturing fortress after fortress in Normandy. French resistance was faltering. Meanwhile, in Paris, tensions between the Armagnac-controlled government and the pro-Burgundian population were high. Many common Parisians resented the Armagnac regime for heavy taxation and the famine and hardship brought by war. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, saw an opportunity to seize Paris and the person of the king, and thus legitimize his power. On the night of May 28, 1418, Paris witnessed a sudden and brutal coup. Burgundian partisans within the city opened one of Paris's gates, according to accounts, possibly the Porte de Buchy, to a Burgundian force. Under cover of darkness, soldiers loyal to John the Fearless poured into the capital. What followed was chaos and bloodshed. The Burgundians and angry Parisian mobs turned on the Armagnacs in the city. Armagnac officials and supporters were hunted down and slaughtered in the streets. This became known as the Massacre of the Armagnacs. Over the next days and weeks, anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 people associated with the Armagnac faction were killed in Paris. Among the victims was the Armagnac leader himself, Bernard of Armagnac, who was captured and brutally murdered on June 12, 1418. The massacre was fueled by years of pent-up hatred and the desire for revenge by the Burgundians and Parisians loyal to them. Caught in the middle of this horrific upheaval was the Dauphin Charles. The 15-year-old prince was residing in Paris when the Burgundian coup began. As enemy soldiers and rioters overran the city, Charles's life was in immediate peril. He was the figurehead of the Armagnac side, the son of the Armagnac's king, and a hated symbol to the Burgundians. In the pre-dawn hours of May 29, 1418, Charles had to flee for his life. Legend and chronicles tell us that one of Charles's loyal protectors, a burly Breton knight named Tanneguy du Châtel, came to his rescue. Tanneguy was the provost of Paris and a die-hard Armagnac supporter. As the Burgundians stormed through the city, Tanneguy raced to the dauphin's quarters, scooped the prince up, possibly still in his nightclothes, and hustled him to safety. In some accounts, Tanneguy had Charles wrapped in a cloak or even a mattress to disguise him. They rushed through the dark streets as violence erupted around them. Reaching a postern gate or a hole in the city wall, Tanneguy and a small band of guards managed to sneak Charles out of Paris just in time. Behind them, their comrades and allies were being butchered, but the heir to the throne narrowly escaped the slaughter. It was a night that Charles would never forget. By dawn, the Burgundians controlled Paris, and they now controlled King Charles VI as well, whom they liberated from Armagnac custody. The Armagnac regime had collapsed, decapitating Charles's support network. The teenage dauphin suddenly found himself a refugee, fleeing south through hostile territory. He had lost the capital, lost many of his mentors and ministers to the massacre, and effectively lost the direct support of his parents. His mother was aligned with the enemy, and his father remained in Burgundian hands. Charles fled to the city of Bourges, in the heart of loyal Armagnac territory, south of the Loire River. There, in the relative safety of central France, he began to rally what remained of the Armagnac loyalists. The King of Bourges, a court in exile. After the dramatic flight from Paris, Charles took up residence in Bourges, a city in the province of Berry. This stronghold, along with other towns in the Loire Valley and southward, became the base of what remained of Valois loyalist France. It was effectively a government in exile, with the legitimate heir Charles at its head, even though he did not yet call himself king. At barely 16, Charles assumed leadership of the Armagnac faction outright. In late 1418, he formally took the title of Regent of France on behalf of his incapacitated father. This was a bold move, essentially declaring that he, not his mother or the Burgundians, was the rightful caretaker of France during the king's madness. To supporters of the Valois line, this was entirely legitimate. To his enemies, it was the pretension of a rebel prince. Charles's court at Bourges tried to maintain the semblance of a French government. A royal council reformed around him, filled with whatever Armagnac loyalists had survived or could join him in the south. He even established a new high court, the Parlement of Poitiers, to administer justice in territories that acknowledged him. From Bourges and nearby towns like Poitiers and Chinon, Charles issued decrees in the name of King Charles VI, asserting that he was carrying on legal governance against a usurping cabal in Paris. These efforts earned him and his followers a measure of legitimacy among southern French nobles and towns. However, to many in northern France now under Burgundian English control, Charles was dismissed as a pretender. It was around this time that opponents mockingly dubbed him the Little King of Bourges. They meant that he was king only of the town of Bourges and its environs, a derisive way to say he had no real power. Indeed, Charles's territory, in 1418, was a fraction of France. Essentially, the area south of the Loire River remained in his hands, with notable exceptions like English-occupied Gascony in the far southwest. The vast regions of northern and eastern France, including Paris, Normandy, and Champagne, were either under Burgundian administration or occupied by the English armies of Henry V. Despite the dire situation, Charles's flight to Bourges had one silver lining. He now fell back into the orbit of his capable mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, the Duchess of Anjou. Yolande had long been an ally and protector of Charles, and in exile, her counsel was invaluable. She provided resources, diplomacy, and at times a stern guiding hand to keep the young prince focused. It was Yolande's influence and the loyalty she inspired in Anjou, Brittany, through family ties, and other southern regions that helped shore up Charles's cause during these dark days. Even as Charles tried to establish his authority in the south, he knew that the civil war with Burgundy had to be addressed. Otherwise, France could never unite against the English. Surprisingly, in the months after the Paris coup, Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy himself reached out to the dauphin. Perhaps John realized that with the English advancing, the French could not afford internal war. Perhaps he thought he could control the dauphin better than the headstrong Armagnacs. Either way, secret negotiations began for a reconciliation between Charles and John. After months of intermediaries working, a meeting was arranged in July 1419 at a place called Pouilly-le-Fort, not far from Melun. There, on July 2nd, 1419, Charles, now 16 years old, met face-to-face with the 49-year-old John the Fearless. They agreed to a truce and a pact of friendship. It was an uneasy reconciliation, sealed with formal oaths, in which Charles and John pledged to share power and aid each other. For a moment, it seemed that the civil war might be resolved, creating a united front against England. The young Charles, no doubt, hoped that by making peace with his cousin John, he could regain the loyalty of Paris and the northern French, bringing legitimacy to his cause. However, any trust between the Dauphin's camp and the Burgundians was fragile. They scheduled a second, more decisive meeting to solidify the peace. This meeting took place on September 10, 1419, on a bridge at Montereau, on the Yonne River. The setting was tense, a small bridge with wooden barriers erected, and each side allowed only a limited escort. Charles arrived with armed Armagnac attendants, including the same Tanneguy du Châtel, who had saved him in Paris, and other loyal knights. Duke John arrived with his own retinue, expecting a diplomatic discussion. What exactly happened on the bridge at Montereau in that moment remains controversial to this day. As Charles and John conversed within the enclosed meeting area, a scuffle or quarrel broke out. The Armagnac guards, perhaps enraged by the memory of John's past crimes or suspecting a trap, set upon the Duke of Burgundy. Tanneguy du Châtel is often credited as one of the men who drew a weapon. In the blink of an eye, John the Fearless was bludgeoned and stabbed to death at the Dauphin's feet. The teenage Charles stood by as the blood of the Burgundian Duke pooled on the bridge. Whether Charles had premeditated this assassination, gave a signal during the meeting, or was genuinely shocked by his men's actions is still debated. At the time, Charles vehemently denied ordering the killing. He claimed it was done without his knowledge, a spontaneous act of vengeance by his entourage. Regardless of intention, the effect was disastrous for Charles's cause. The murder of John the Fearless eliminated any hope of a negotiated peace between the Armagnacs, now effectively the Dauphinists, and the Burgundians. When news of the assassination spread, Burgundian loyalists were outraged. John's son and heir, Philip the Good, became the new Duke of Burgundy, and he was utterly unforgiving. A deep personal vendetta now fueled Burgundian policy. Philip the Good threw aside any notion of compromise with Charles. Instead, he forged a full alliance with King Henry V of England. In essence, the French Civil War merged with the 100 Years' War. Philip agreed to support Henry V's claims to the French throne, in exchange for English support for Burgundy's territorial ambitions. The Armagnac, Valois faction, led by Charles, was to be isolated and crushed by this new Anglo-Burgundian partnership. The Treaty of Troyes, 1420. Disinheriting a prince. The murder at Montereau directly paved the way for one of the most infamous deals in French history, the Treaty of Troyes of 1420. With the Burgundians and English now allied, Queen Isabeau, Charles's mother, also lent her support to their cause. King Charles VI, senile and manipulated by those around him, was essentially a pawn. In May 1420, in the city of Troyes, a treaty was signed that sought to utterly reshape the succession of the French crown. Under the Treaty of Troyes, King Charles VI agreed that upon his death, the crown of France would not pass to his son Charles, but instead to Henry V of England and Henry's heirs. To cement this alliance, Henry V married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI, and thus young Charles's own sister. The treaty recognized Henry V as regent of France during Charles VI's remaining lifetime, and as the legitimate heir to the French throne thereafter. In effect, the treaty disinherited the Dauphin Charles entirely, cutting him out of the royal line of succession. The implications of Troyes were staggering. If enforced, it would unite the crowns of England and France under Henry V and his descendants, creating a dual monarchy. For France, it meant foreign conquest was formalized. The English king would become King of France, and the Valois lineage would be set aside. To justify this drastic step, the Anglo-Burgundian coalition undertook a campaign to vilify Charles. Propaganda and legal proceedings depicted Charles not as the rightful prince, but as a criminal and impostor. Burgundian pamphlets whispered that Charles was illegitimate, that he was not the true son of King Charles VI at all, but the product of Queen Isabeau's rumoured adultery with the late Duke of Orléans. This slander aimed to undermine Charles's hereditary claim. Additionally, Charles was formally accused of the enormous crime of murdering John the Fearless. In 1420, he was summoned to Paris, now under Burgundian control, to answer for this crime before the Parisian Parliament. Of course, Charles, still in the south and at war, did not appear. In his absence, a court declared him guilty of treason and regicide. On these grounds, the treaty's supporters claimed Charles VI was justified in disinheriting his unworthy son. King Charles VI, likely not fully lucid and under duress, went along with this judgment, effectively condemning his own offspring. From Charles' perspective in Bourges, the Treaty of Troyes was nothing less than a death sentence for his royal ambitions. At 17 years old, he was declared a traitor and stripped of his birthright by his father's act. One can only imagine the blow this dealt to the young prince's morale. The very monarchy he was fighting to preserve had officially cast him aside. In the eyes of the Anglo-Burgundian alliance, Charles was now an outlaw, a rebel against the legitimate King Henry V of France. Yet, despite this seemingly hopeless decree, Charles did not surrender. To his credit, and thanks to the encouragement of loyal followers, he rejected the Treaty of Troyes outright. The Armagnac loyalists rallied around the principle that Troyes was made under coercion, and that the mad king had no right to bar his own son from the throne. They continued to recognize Charles as the true heir. Indeed, many French people, especially in central and southern regions not occupied by the enemy, felt deep resentment at the idea of an English king. To them, disinheriting the Valois prince was unthinkable. A new terminology developed. Those French nobles, knights, and citizens who remained loyal to Charles's claim referred to themselves as the party of the king, meaning King Charles VI's true French heirs, distinguishing themselves from the Anglo-Burgundian collaborators. While the Treaty of Troyes fragmented France politically, it also clarified things in a way. There were now essentially two claimants to rule France. In the north, Henry V, by right of treaty, and after him his infant son would claim the crown with Burgundian backing. In the south, Charles claimed the crown by right of blood, backed by Armagnac partisans and patriotic loyalists. The Civil War and the Foreign War had merged into a singular struggle for the soul of France. Holding the line, Charles in the south, 1421 to 1422. After 1420, Charles, though not yet king in title, acted as the uncrowned king of the regions that remained faithful to him. His court in exile at Bourges continued to function as a government. They controlled roughly the central and southern third of France. This included the fertile Loire Valley and territories like Berry, Touraine, Poitou, Auvergne, Languedoc, and others. Notably, however, Guyenne, Aquitaine, in the far southwest, including Bordeaux, was firmly in English hands as it had been for generations. Burgundy and Normandy were lost to Charles's side. It was a tenuous domain to defend, but it was something. In these years, Charles showed flashes of initiative and courage, despite his youth. He realized that to keep the loyalty of his followers, he had to demonstrate leadership on the battlefield as well as in politics. One boost to his cause came from an age-old alliance, Scotland. The Scots were traditional allies of France against the English, the Old Alliance. In 1420 to 21, hundreds of seasoned Scottish soldiers, possibly thousands, arrived in France to aid the dauphin. These Scottish allies, led by nobles like John Stuart, Earl of Buchan, and Archibald, Earl of Douglas, provided a much-needed backbone to Charles's army. Their presence would soon yield a significant victory. On March 22, 1421, a Franco-Scottish force met an English army at the Battle of Beaujais in Anjou. Charles was not present at the battle personally, but it was fought in his name. The result was a rare French victory. In a sharp clash, the Allied forces surprised and routed the English, killing the English commander, who happened to be King Henry V's own brother, Thomas, Duke of Clarence. The Battle of Beaujais was a ray of light in a dark time. It proved that the English could be beaten and avenged to some degree the humiliation of Agincourt. When news of Beaujais reached Charles, it must have been immensely heartening. In gratitude and savvy politics, Charles appointed the Scottish Earl of Buchan, John Stuart, as the new Constable of France, the kingdom's top military commander, in 1421. This honoured the Scots' contribution and bound them closer to his cause. Emboldened by Beaujeu and with the energetic Scots bolstering his ranks, Charles undertook some offensive actions. In June 1421, the 18-year-old dauphin led an army into the field in central France. Dressed proudly in heraldic colours of red, white and blue, the Valois colours, Charles reportedly exhibited personal bravery and a flair for command. He recaptured the small fortress of Galadon from a pro-Burgundian garrison on June 25, 1421. Displaying resolve, and perhaps sending a message, Charles ordered the executed garrison commander's body hung from the walls as a traitor. He then moved against the larger town of Chartres, an important city not far from Paris. Charles's forces invested Chartres, laying siege and threatening to bring the fight closer to areas under Henry V's control. For a brief moment, it looked as though Charles might be able to turn the tables and reclaim some northern territories. However, events elsewhere intervened. King Henry V, alarmed by the loss at Beaujeu and Charles's newfound aggression, returned to France from England with reinforcements. By the summer of 1421, Henry resumed a ferocious campaign to crush the remaining Armagnac resistance. Faced with the might of Henry's armies, Charles prudently pulled back south of the Loire to avoid a direct confrontation he might lose. Chartres remained in enemy hands. Charles's strategy at this point showed a notable characteristic: caution. While some among his followers urged bold action, the young dauphin often chose to avoid major pitched battles with the English, knowing that another disastrous defeat could spell the end of his cause. This caution would frustrate allies and earn him a reputation for timidity in some quarters, but it likely preserved the core of his forces for when they were truly needed. Amid the continuing war, life went on for the exiled court. In December 1422, Charles married his betrothed, Marie of Anjou, in the city of Bourges. This marriage, planned long ago, was now a vital political alliance. Marie was the daughter of King Louis II of Anjou, a claimant to the Kingdom of Naples, and Yolande of Aragon. By formally marrying Marie, Charles cemented the loyalty of the House of Anjou to his cause. The wedding was a bright spot in dreary times, attended by the ragtag but determined nobility of the Dauphin's domain. The year 1422 proved to be momentous. On August 31, 1422, King Henry V of England, the formidable adversary who had brought France to its knees, died suddenly of illness, likely dysentery, while on campaign. Henry was just 35 and in the prime of his conquests. His death sent shockwaves through the English forces and their Burgundian allies. Though Henry had won nearly every battle he fought, he could not escape disease. Importantly, Henry V died before King Charles VI of France, meaning Henry never technically wore the French crown he claimed. That prize would pass to his infant son. The English king left behind a baby boy, Henry VI, only 9 months old, as his heir. The English war effort was now in the hands of regents, principally Henry's brother, the Duke of Bedford. Only a few weeks later, another death changed the balance. On October 21, 1422, the long-suffering King Charles VI of France died in Paris. With Charles VI's passing, the French throne was technically vacant and contested. According to the Treaty of Troyes, baby Henry VI of England was now, in the Anglo-Burgundian view, King of France, with his uncle Bedford as regent. But to the Armagnacs in the south, the treaty was illegitimate. By strict dynastic right, the crown should pass to the late king's surviving son, their Charles, the Dauphin. Thus, in October 1422, Charles, now 19 years old, claimed the title King of France. His supporters proclaimed him King Charles VII by right of succession. It must be noted that Charles VII's accession in 1422 was quite unusual. He assumed the kingly title, but he could not be crowned in the traditional manner at Reims. That city, along with the ancient royal regalia, lay deep in enemy territory. So there was no grand coronation ceremony then, just a recognition by his court and followers that he was now king. To many neutral observers, Charles's claim looked tenuous. The north of France still denied him, and even the Pope hesitated to choose between the two claimants. The sarcastic nickname, King of Bourges, stuck more than ever, implying Charles was a king without a kingdom. reigning only in the backwater of Berry. Nonetheless, the psychological importance of Charles formally taking the title should not be underestimated. The fiction that he was merely a regent for his father was over. Charles now openly declared himself the King of France, as his partisans had always believed him to be. For them, Henry VI was a foreign usurper. Thus, by late 1422, the stage was set for the next phase, a war of two kings, the boy king Henry VI, represented by his English and Burgundian generals, versus the young King Charles VII, trying to solidify his rule over the loyal parts of France, king in name, but not in Paris, 1422 to 1428. The years following Charles's assumption of the kingship were exceedingly difficult for him and his supporters. Charles VII, as we can now call him, faced monumental challenges. First, his realm was impoverished and war-torn. The financial situation was dire. Revenues from the rich northern cities were cut off, and even in the south, people were war-weary. The Estates General, a sort of assembly, had granted some taxes, but not nearly enough. To keep his government running and armies in the field, Charles resorted to borrowing heavily from noblemen and bankers. He mortgaged lands and tapped any source of credit available. Economic strain made it hard to pay and feed his soldiers, which in turn could lead to indiscipline or desertion. Second, the military situation remained largely unfavourable. After Henry V's death, the Duke of Bedford took charge of English operations in France and proved a competent leader. With Burgundian assistance, Bedford worked to secure English control over northern France. In 1423, the English and Burgundians, along with the Duke of Brittany, formed an alliance at the Congress of Amiens, further isolating Charles. The Allied enemies scored key victories against Charles's forces in these years. One major setback was the Battle of Crevant in 1423 in Burgundy, where a French-Scottish army was defeated by the Anglo-Burgundians. A worse blow came in August 1424 at the Battle of Verneuil in Normandy. At Verneuil, Charles's field army, which included the remaining hardy Scottish auxiliaries, engaged a strong English force. The battle turned into a slaughter reminiscent of Agincourt. The French and Scots were decisively defeated. Thousands were killed. The Earl of Buchan, Charles's Scottish constable, was slain along with many of his countrymen. Verneuil was called by some a second Agincourt due to the scale of the Franco-Scottish losses. This defeat left Charles's military capabilities crippled for some time, and it reinforced English dominance north of the Loire. For Charles, these battlefield losses were compounded by internal troubles at his court. He was a young king trying to navigate factional politics among his own advisors. With many of the original Armagnac leaders gone, new power brokers emerged. One was Georges de la Trémoille, a cunning nobleman who became Charles's chamberlain and favourite. La Trémoille was influential, but notoriously self-interested. In 1425, Charles's ever-loyal ally, Yolande of Aragon, grew concerned about the direction of the war effort and the counsel the king was receiving. Listening to Yolande, Charles took a bold step. He appointed Arthur de Richemont as Constable of France in 1425. Arthur de Richemont was the brother of the Duke of Brittany and also brother-in-law to the Duke of Burgundy, a high-ranking noble with wide connections. By bringing Richemont into the fold as his chief military officer, Charles hoped to strengthen his army and perhaps even sway Brittany or Burgundy away from the English alliance. Richemont was an experienced soldier and had a fierce determination to drive out the English. Yet this decision sparked further intrigue. Richemont clashed with La Trémoille and other courtiers in Charles's inner circle. At one point, Richemont had one of Charles's prime ministers executed for corruption, an act that soured his relationship with the king for a time. Before long, La Trémoille managed to poison Charles's mind against the new constable, portraying Richemont as overbearing. The king oscillated between advisors, struggling to maintain unity in his camp. By 1427, Richemont was temporarily out of favour, only to return later, and La Trémoille's influence was paramount. These internal divisions hampered effective decision-making. Charles found himself beset by court politics when he most needed clear direction in the war. Despite the difficulties, Charles VII demonstrated resilience simply by continuing to hold out. He shifted his base of operations among strongholds south of the Loire, towns like Chinon, Bourges and Poitiers, staying constantly on the move, both for safety and to maintain presence among his people. So long as he remained free and at large, he was a living banner for French resistance. Many local communities and minor nobles in central France continued to recognize him and provide what support they could, even if that support was often limited. By 1428, however, the noose was tightening. The English regent Bedford, frustrated that Charles still eluded his grasp, decided to strike a decisive blow into the heart of Charles's territory. The target was Orléans, a large strategically vital city on the Loire River. Orléans was the last major city on the northern side of the Loire still loyal to Charles. It guarded the river crossing into southern France. If the English could capture Orléans, they would have an open road into the rich Loire heartland, and potentially could march on Bourges or other southern centres. In essence, the fall of Orléans might finally splinter Charles's kingdom and enable an English victory in the war. So, in October 1428, an English army led by the Earl of Salisbury laid siege to Orléans. The city's defenders, loyal to Charles, braced for a long siege. They were commanded by courageous captains such as Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, half-brother to the captive Duke of Orléans. Charles VII, now 25 years old, faced his gravest crisis yet. From his court, he watched and worried as Orléans was surrounded. He managed to send some small relief forces or supplies, but his means were limited. The English constructed a ring of fortified camps around Orléans, slowly strangling the city. Winter of 1428-29 set in, and still Orléans held out, but the outlook was bleak. At this time, Charles's spirit was at a low ebb. He had been at war continuously for over a decade, ever since he was a boy. He had known little but defeat, retreat, and the treachery of politics. The Burgundians still would not reconcile. The English were relentless, and his own resources were nearly exhausted. According to accounts from those close to him, King Charles VII fell into a state of discouragement. Some chroniclers say he even considered the unthinkable, abandoning the fight. He mulled the idea of fleeing into exile, perhaps to Spain or Scotland, anywhere safe from the English juggernaut, or making some kind of shameful peace that would concede vast territories to England, just so he could keep a small realm. Imagine the weight on this young king's shoulders. At 25, he was bearing the blame for not expelling the invaders and not uniting his country. The future looked grim and short for King of Bourges, Charles. As the siege of Orléans dragged into early 1429, it became a symbol of France's struggle. To the French loyalists, Orléans was the last gasp of hope. If it fell, many believed all of France might fall. To the English, capturing Orléans would likely clinch their conquest. Both sides sensed the high stakes. It was precisely at this desperate juncture that an unexpected saviour emerged from the most unlikely of places. A divine wind was about to blow through Charles's court and change the course of his life and France's destiny forever. The Maid of Orléans, Joan of Arc's divine mission. In the bleak winter of 1429, as Orléans struggled under siege, rumours reached Charles's court of a remarkable young woman from the far fringes of the realm. In a village called Domremy, on the border of the duchies of Lorraine and Champagne, a peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc, known in English as Joan of Arc, was claiming to have received visions from God. She said that saints and angels were guiding her with a sacred mission to drive out the English and see that the dauphin Charles was crowned King of France. At first blush, this seemed absurd, a teenage peasant girl imagining herself a war leader. Yet these were times of miracles and portents, and France was a realm steeped in faith. The common people, suffering under invasion and civil war, whispered that only divine intervention could save France now. Joan of Arc appeared convinced that she was chosen as that divine instrument. In February 1429, Joan made her way to a local French garrison commander, insisting that she must be taken to see King Charles. Initially dismissed, Joan's persistence, and perhaps an uncanny charisma, eventually won an escort. Word of her fervour and supposed visions preceded her as she travelled across enemy-controlled territory towards the Loire Valley. After a difficult winter journey, Joan of Arc arrived at the town of Chinon, where Charles VII was then holding court in March 1429. Charles's advisers were deeply sceptical. Some warned that this could be a Burgundian or English trick, or that Joan might be possessed by witchcraft. Others, perhaps influenced by Yolande of Aragon or desperate for any hope, urged Charles to at least meet the girl. Charles himself, curious but cautious, agreed to receive her, but he decided to test her claim first. According to one famous story, when Joan was brought into the great hall of the castle at Chinon, Charles disguised himself in ordinary court attire and placed another well-dressed noble on the throne to play the king. Joan, who had never seen Charles, was not fooled. She reportedly walked straight up to Charles in the crowd, bowed, and said, "God give you good life, gentle king." Some say she even revealed to him a private prayer or secret he had made to God, convincing him that her inspiration was real. This moment, whether embellished or true, has become legendary as proof of Joan's divine insight. In private conversations, Joan told Charles that she had been sent by God to raise the siege of Orléans and lead him to his crowning at Reims. She referred to him as the true heir of France, calling him gentle dauphin, gentle prince, since he wasn't crowned yet, and assured him that God believed in his legitimacy, even if earthly men did not. For a king who had heard only doubts and insults about his claim, this must have been powerful emotional medicine. Still, Charles was unsure. To be responsible, he ordered theologians to examine Joan's claims. The clergy at Poitiers questioned Joan's virginity, orthodoxy, and motives. In the end, they found nothing heretical about her. She was devout, claimed to be guided by St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret, and her humility and resolve impressed them. Their report essentially said, no human could know if she truly had a mission from God, but nothing about her contradicted the Catholic faith. Desperate times might call for accepting such inspiration. Thus, by late March 1429, Charles VII made the fateful decision to put Joan of Arc to the test on the battlefield. He provided her with a suit of armour, a banner emblazoned with the fleur-de-lis and images of God and saints, and a small army to reinforce Orléans. Seasoned commanders like the Maréchal de Boussac, Gilles de Rais, and Jean de Dunois would accompany her. It's important to note, Charles did not put Joan solely in command of all strategy, but he clearly gave her an unprecedented role for a woman of her station. She was allowed to lead the vanguard of a relief column and act as a figurehead to inspire troops and inhabitants alike. Perhaps Charles thought that, at worst, her presence could lift morale, and at best, if her voices were real, France might gain a miracle. It was a gamble by a king with little left to lose. Before Joan departed, there was one more poignant scene. Joan apparently made a bold prediction to Charles. She told him that in a battle to come, he would indeed be crowned king in Reims, the traditional place of coronation, and that this would happen within the year. She allegedly identified herself as La Pucelle, the maid, who would make it so. Charles, who had waited years for that crowning moment he feared might never come, could only hope these prophecies were true. The liberation of Orléans, 1429. A turning point. In April 1429, Joan of Arc and the French relief force approached the beleaguered city of Orléans. The city had been under siege for about 6 months. Its people were hungry and exhausted, but still resisting under leaders like Dunois. The English, numbering a few thousand, had built a series of forts, bastilles, encircling Orléans, especially guarding the bridges and river approaches. Initially, Joan's arrival was stalled. The first attempt to enter the city was thwarted by an English fort's artillery. But on April 29th, 1429, Joan of Arc managed to get inside Orléans, to the ecstatic cheers of the townsfolk and soldiers. Her mere presence electrified the defenders. Here was a young woman in white armour, carrying a banner and speaking of God's favour, who had somehow made it through enemy lines. It seemed like a sign that heaven had not abandoned them. Over the next week, Joan participated in a flurry of military actions to break the siege. Though she did not command the army in a modern sense, professional captains still planned strategy. She proved fearless on the field and had an undeniable inspirational effect. On May 4th, the French struck the English-held fort of Saint-Lô and captured it. On May 5th, Ascension Day, Joan insisted on making the English aware they could still surrender honourably. Her offer was ignored. On May 6th, she led an attack on the fortifications at Saint-Jean-le-Blanc and Les Augustins. During these skirmishes, Joan was in the thick of combat. carrying her banner to rally the men. She reportedly urged the soldiers forward, saying her famous line, "Fear not, the Lord guides us." The culminating fight came on May 7th, 1429, targeting the strongest English bastion, Les Tourelles, a fort guarding the bridge over the Loire. This was a bloody assault. Joan climbed a ladder to the ramparts, and as she urged men upward, an arrow struck her in the shoulder or neck, knocking her off the ladder. For a moment, the French faltered as Joan fell back, wounded, but she refused to leave the field. She is said to have prayed, had the arrow pulled out, and returned to the fray later that afternoon. Pain be damned. Her reappearance reinvigorated the French fighters. By evening, they took Les Tourelles, forcing the English to abandon their positions across the river. The remaining English, demoralized and astonished, decided to lift the siege. On May 8, 1429, the siege of Orléans was over. The English retreated. The city was saved. The lifting of the siege of Orléans was a milestone of incalculable importance. It was the first major French victory in a pitched operation against the English in years. To the French, especially the common people, it was nothing short of a miracle. Joan of Arc instantly became known as the Maid of Orleans, and King Charles's fortunes experienced a 180-degree turn. His cause had been given new life. Soldiers who had been fearful of the invincible English longbowmen now saw that the English were not unbeatable. In fact, within days of Orléans, the French army, now surging with confidence, went on the offensive. They cleared the Loire Valley of remaining English outposts in a series of swift blows. In June 1429, French forces under Joan and professional commanders, La Hire, Saint-Traille, Dunois, and others, captured the towns of Jargeau and Meung-sur-Loire and won a significant open-field victory at the Battle of Patay on June 18. At Patay, the French heavy cavalry surprised and overwhelmed an English force that included the famous longbowmen and the notable English commander, Sir John Talbot. The English army was effectively routed. Their archers failed to deploy defences in time and were ridden down. Casualties were heavy on the English side, while French losses were minimal. It was as if the spell of Agincourt had been broken, the myth of English invincibility shattered. After Patay, the road north lay open. Now Joan pressed Charles to seize the opportunity to achieve what she believed was her God-given mission, bringing Charles to be anointed as king at Reims Cathedral. Reims, far to the northeast, was the traditional site where French kings were crowned and consecrated with holy oil. Importantly, Reims at that moment was held by the Burgundians, not by Charles. A coronation there seemed like a risky endeavour deep in enemy territory. Charles's senior advisors, ever cautious, were hesitant, but Joan's string of victories had given her great credibility. She urged Charles to act boldly, to claim visibly what was his by right. Eventually, Charles VII agreed to the daring plan. In July 1429, Charles and his court, along with the now formidable French army, set out from the Loire on a grand march northeast towards Reims. This journey was an incredible gamble, marching for hundreds of miles through towns that might be hostile. Yet something amazing happened. One by one, the towns along the route, seeing the tide turning and inspired by Joan's mystique, opened their gates to Charles. The city of Troyes, the very place where the Disinheritance Treaty had been signed 9 years before, surrendered to Charles' forces without a fight after some negotiation, and perhaps after seeing a bit of John-led military demonstration outside their walls. Other towns, like Auxerre, Neutral, and Chalons, either yielded or welcomed the approach of the Valois king. The populace was switching sides, tired of English occupation and perhaps moved by this wave of apparent divine favour. On July 16, 1429, Charles's host reached Reims. The Burgundian-held city saw the writing on the wall. The citizens compelled the pro-Burgundy governor to capitulate. Reims threw open its gates and received Charles with celebrations. It must have been an emotional moment for Charles VII, entering the grand city of coronation, which he may have never thought he'd see as a free king. Preparations were made quickly for the coronation ceremony. The next day, July 17, 1429, in the hallowed cathedral of Reims, Charles was formally anointed and crowned King of France. The ancient rites were performed by the Archbishop of Reims using the holy anointing oil, the Saint-Ampoule, that legend said had been brought by an angel for the coronation of the first Frankish king, Clovis. At Charles's side, among the attendees, stood Joan of Arc in her armour and holding her banner, reportedly weeping for joy as the crown was placed on Charles's head. After the ceremony, Joan knelt before the newly crowned king, no longer the uncrowned dauphin, but truly King Charles VII by the grace of God, and famously said, "Gentle king, now is accomplished the pleasure of God, who willed that you should come to Reims to receive your rightful coronation." It was a moment of triumph that few could have imagined mere months earlier. This coronation was not just a ceremonial nicety, it had profound significance in the medieval mindset. In the eyes of many French people, especially those wavering in allegiance, Charles now indisputably had the sacred legitimacy of a consecrated monarch. The English had crowned the infant Henry VI as King of France in Paris in 1431 in response, but that lacked the tradition and gravitas of Reims. Charles' coronation undermined the Treaty of Troyes, for how could a crowned and anointed French king be set aside? The Burgundians found themselves in a more morally ambiguous position. Were they fighting for the rightful King of France anymore, or aiding a foreign occupation? The event at Reims galvanized French loyalism. Many in the north who had been collaborating began to reconsider. For Charles personally, being crowned was a validation he desperately needed. After years of being disparaged as the King of Bourges and a dispossessed prince, he had taken the central step to solidify his reign. It marked the beginning of what would become France's long road to recovery and victory in the 100 Years' War. Aftermath and legacy of a young leader. The period following the Reims coronation saw Charles VII's fortunes much improved, though the war was not over. Joan of Arc wanted to press the advantage and attempt to liberate Paris next. Charles, ever cautious and influenced by his more conservative advisors like La Trémoille, did not fully capitalize on the momentum. An attack on Paris in September 1429 failed, and Joan was eventually captured by Burgundian forces in 1430, later executed by the English in 1431. Her dramatic story had a tragic end, but her impact had already altered the course of history. Crucially, Charles VII had undergone a transformation by 1429. No longer the hesitant youth on the verge of giving up, he was now a legitimized king with a cause that had been invigorated by Joan's victories. The early 1430s saw a stalemate, but Charles carefully rebuilt his position. His mother-in-law Yolande of Aragon continued to work behind the scenes. In fact, soon after the coronation, Yolande helped oust the divisive La Trémoille from Charles's court, removing that bad influence. Charles reconciled with Constable Arthur de Richemont, who returned to leading the royal armies with effectiveness. The unity and discipline of Charles's side increased in the years after Joan. One of Charles's shrewdest moves to solidify his comeback was diplomatic rather than military. In 1435, Charles VII finally achieved what had seemed impossible, a reconciliation with the Duke of Burgundy. The Treaty of Arras, 1435, ended the long enmity stemming from the 1419 murder. Charles agreed to humble terms. He formally apologized for the killing of John the Fearless at Montereau. Though he had not done it himself, he acknowledged the wrongdoing. In return, Philip the Good of Burgundy broke his alliance with the English and recognized Charles VII as the true King of France. This was a monumental step. Suddenly, the English found themselves isolated in France without their powerful Burgundian ally. Paris, which had been under English Burgundian control, reopened its gates to Charles's forces in 1436, and the king made a triumphant entry into his capital at last. From the 1430s into the 1440s, Charles VII matured into an effective ruler. The timid King of Bourges gave way to a more assertive monarch who implemented reforms. He and his ministers, many of bourgeois background whom he came to trust, built a more centralized administration and reformed the army. For example, in the 1440s, Charles established the first standing companies of professional troops, the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, and implemented regular taxation to pay them, reducing reliance on feudal levies and mercenaries. These changes greatly strengthened France's military capacity. With Burgundy neutralized and his army reformed, Charles resumed the offensive against the English. Key victories followed. The reconquest of Normandy. culminating in the Battle of Formigny in 1450, and the reconquest of Guyenne with the Battle of Castillon in 1453. Castillon in 1453 definitively ended the 100 Years' War in France's favour, save for the port of Calais, which remained English. For his success in expelling the English and restoring France, Charles VII later earned the epithet Charles the Victorious. It's an outcome that would have seemed almost impossible during his teenage years of exile. Reflecting on Charles's early life and wartime leadership, one can see a remarkable arc. At 14, he was a scared boy thrust into a role far above his experience, facing impossible odds. He survived assassination attempts, political betrayals, and military disasters. Through it all, Charles exhibited a kind of quiet resilience. He was often cautious to a fault and prone to indecision, especially before Joan's arrival, leading some contemporaries to criticize him as apathetic or overly hesitant. But in hindsight, that caution kept his cause alive when rash action might have led to annihilation. He avoided total defeat long enough for fortune to turn. Charles's partnership with Joan of Arc is especially notable. It speaks to his ability to recognize and embrace an unexpected solution. While some at court mocked or doubted Joan, Charles took the leap of faith to empower her. That decision, born of desperation but also intuition, was the catalyst for France's revival. Charles VII laid the groundwork by maintaining a loyal power base in southern France, refusing to concede his legitimacy even when disinherited, and keeping the embers of resistance burning. Joan's intervention was the spark that ignited those embers into a flame. In the end, the legacy of Charles's early reign is that of a leader who came of age under fire. He inherited a crown with little more than a flimsy title and a war-torn land to his name. Yet from the chaos of his youth, through civil war, foreign invasion, and personal hardship, Charles VII emerged to lead France in a victorious direction. His story demonstrates how a nation's fate can hang on the resolve of its leader to never give up hope. The boy dauphin, ridiculed as the King of Bourges in his teens, would, by the time of his death in 1461, be remembered as the king who presided over the expulsion of the English and the resurrection of France. Charles VII's early trials and ultimate triumph set France on the path to recovery, and they opened a new chapter in French history. The once disinherited prince had vindicated his claim, thanks in part to the faith of a peasant girl and his own endurance. His life's journey from a besieged teenaged heir to a victorious king is a testament to perseverance amid adversity. A dramatic tale worthy of the grandest documentary, and indeed one of the great turning points of medieval history.